I will call this meeting of the Lane County Board of Commissioners to order, a special meeting today. Thank you, Mark, for preparing our work before us today. Briefly, I'll go through the agenda. We have one single candidate interview for the position of performance auditor. That candidate is scheduled to interview at 9 o'clock, short discussion prior to bringing in the candidate. Subsequent to the interview, we'll have a public comment period, open for public comment, and then after that, we'll retire into executive session. As we move into the candidate questions, we have prepared 5 questions, and so I'd like to ask if there is a preference of which question each commissioner would ask. What I'd suggest is that we each ask one question. I'll ask number 5 in that order, and then any preference as to the questions that you'd like to ask. My pen doesn't have a filler. Can you believe that?
My suggestion is that we go by district number, except you switch with someone else. I mean, in other words, somebody else picks.
You want me to ask the first
I
question?
guess you're 5, so if he's going to pick 5, we should pick 4. If he does 4, then we're all on our district.
Okay. So then, question 1 is going to be, I don't know the commission district numbers.
I'm 1.
I'm 4.
He's 1.
So Jay, Sid.
I'm 3.
Okay, and then you'll be 4 and I'll be 5. Okay, very good. And then after question 5 is asked, I'll go ahead and offer the option for the candidate to ask us questions. So to move to that, we'll, without any discussion on the candidate questions, we'll step into executive session, which I believe is going to be in the BCC small. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Then we are ready to move forward. Any questions on the agenda, on the order of the agenda? Okay. Ms. Mokraski, order looks good. Okay. Once again, Marcia, thank you very much. We have before us one single candidate. The committee, the Performance Audit Committee, conducted interviews from 4 candidates. There were 4 scheduled. Only 3 actually showed up for interviews yesterday.
Yes.
And it was reduced to 1. In the executive session, we'll receive a little bit of a briefing on how yesterday's interview session went before we go into deliberation. And we'll discuss what the options are during deliberation. So we are ready for the first candidate. The first candidate is going to be Ian Green. And we'll go with Sid. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Green. Please have a seat.
Thank you.
To give you a brief round of introductions, I'm Pat Farr, Chair of the Board.
Nice to meet you, Pat.
And I'm Jay Bozovich. I'm Vice Chair.
I'm Pete Sorensen, Lane County Commissioner, South Eugene.
Steve Dingle, County Counsel.
I'm Marshall Edwards, Human Resources Director.
Steve Mokraski, Lane County Administrator.
Gary Williams, Lane County Board of Commissioners.
Sid Lykin, Lane County Board and Springfield District.
Thank you. Then
Devin Ashbridge, Public Information Officer.
Ms. Green will each ask you a question, give you an opportunity to respond. Following that, I'll give you an opportunity to ask questions of the board if you have any.
Okay.
And we'll begin today's interviews with Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. So, Ian, if you could tell us about your related education and experience and the types of performance audits you have conducted, and describe how you develop your work plan and the steps involved in approaching an audit.
Certainly. So my educational background is in economics. I have both my bachelor's and master's degree in economics from Portland State University, and that really provides a good foundational skill set. The program involved a lot of data analytics, logic, problem solving, so it really leads well to performance auditing. I also have 2 auditing credentials. I'm a certified fraud examiner, as well as a certified government auditing professional. Both of those demonstrate my capacity and competency to perform governmental audits and fraud investigations. I'm also currently pursuing my certified internal auditor designation right now, although I have not completed those exams at this point. I've worked for the Oregon Secretary of State Audits Division for the past 6 years doing performance audits. I've worked on a variety of projects. I'll kind of start with my first one and work my way up to most recent. My first audit was looking at Department of Corrections overtime expenditures. There was concern among policymakers that overtime was really eating into the state's general fund and the budget, and they wanted to eliminate any potential waste in that area. So we went about analyzing the entire state's payroll records for the Corrections Department over a series of years to look for trends and patterns that could maybe indicate excessive overtime and areas of cost savings. We also calculated the cost per hour of delivering overtime versus hiring a new employee. And one of the surprising things that came out of that, and it was kind of a shock to everybody in the office, is that in the right circumstances, overtime is significantly less expensive than hiring a new employee. So if you're manning a correctional officer post in a prison, it needs to be manned 24/7. If overtime demand is only needed in that position, say 20, 30, 40% of the time, if you hire a new person into that, you're paying them for an entire year, when in reality that demand for work is 2 to 4, 600 hours, and it's significantly less expensive to do that. The savings on reducing overtime is when you have that constant overtime. If it's occurring 100% of the shifts, 100% of the time, that's where you really want to hire a new employee. There's also safety considerations we discussed in that audit. The next audit I did looked at the Department of Human Services and how they developed their budget. There was concern among some state legislators that the Department of Human Services was manipulating a forecasting process for how many people would be on their caseloads. And one of the things we found during the course of that audit was that the director of the agency had, in fact, asked the forecasters to increase one particular caseload. And it was a very expensive caseload. And that allowed them to basically stockpile about $30 million in their budget that they then could reallocate later, kind of by stepping past that legislative control funding. And it was a caseload for blind and disabled people, so it didn't really, when people saw the increase, they supported it because everybody generally supports assisting blind and disabled people, but really that's driven by demographics. And what the director had asked the unit to do was to base it on the recession that was occurring at the time. And really you don't have more blind people because the economy is crashing. You have more blind people based on a probability of how many people are born blind or become blind in their lifetime. So that was a really interesting finding. I also worked on an audit after that at the Department of Human Services as well, looking at the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. And that program is commonly known as welfare. It's cash assistance to the most needy populations out there. And one of the challenges in that program is that they had the worst performance in the nation for assisting people to get into activities that would help them transition back to work. And at the same time, their caseload growth was the fastest in the nation. So you had caseworkers at the ground level handling over 200 cases, which equated to them having less than 30 minutes per month per family to help them transition back to work. So it was really overburdened. And one of the outcomes of that was really reallocating funding to that caseworker level and the service level to really help that population get the assistance they needed. I followed that, and that TANF audit won a national award for Best Large Performance Audit in the nation from the National State Auditors Association. I followed that with 2 audits at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The first one was a financial condition review. The agency had struggled with kind of their declining revenue from loss of sales of fishing and hunting license, loss of federal funds, lottery funds, and at the same time rapidly increasing expenditures. So we were trying to get an assessment of what their current financial position was. And during the course of that audit, we found that this wasn't a short-term or recent issue. I kept going back in the archives and the Ways and Means hearings, and I would go back 6 years. They had the same issue. I'd go back 6 years before they had the same issue. Eventually, I ended in 1970, where this exact same issue was really plaguing that agency. So our second audit was trying to address recommendations to how do you plan for these difficult financial times? How do you develop a strategic plan to really lead the agency on long-term thinking rather than the short-term thinking that constantly led to these budget shortfalls they were facing? I also worked on an audit of IT security across the state recently, and I'll discuss that more details in the next question because I think that is more applicable there. And then right now I'm doing an audit of the Medicaid program in the state of Oregon. And this is the largest state program. 1 out of $3 in the state is spent on Medicaid. And we've had some pretty significant findings already. You may have seen it in the news, but we issued an auditor alert a couple weeks ago about a population of people that were ineligible for benefits and had never been terminated in the system. And that population was 14,000 people, costing the state approximately $6 million per month. We also identified another 100,000 people that had never gone through an eligibility determination that's supposed to occur on an annual basis. So that's an ongoing audit, but we've already issued a couple findings in that area.
Commissioner Bozic, does that satisfy your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Lycan will have the second question.
Mr. Chair, so tell us about the most challenging audit you've conducted. What were some of the challenges you faced? And describe the approach you used. And finally, what were the findings?
Okay.
If you need me to repeat the question, please
Okay.
feel free.
So, as I mentioned earlier, I worked on a statewide IT security audit last year, and that was really challenging because I'd never gone and done an IT audit before. So, one of the approaches I used was really delving into the audit reports that our office had issued, and IT auditing is very related to performance auditing. It's a very specific specialized subset that is focused on information technology systems. So I went through the past decade of audit reports our agency had issued to really become familiar with that, really learn the process, learn that area of auditing, as well as also gaining a deeper understanding of the IT standards that are out there. There's various frameworks. There's an ISO 27001 and 27002 framework. That's an international security controls that should be in place to protect information technology systems, as well as a federal framework called PhysCam and then another international framework called COBIT. So really understanding what controls needed to be in place to protect information security. The other challenge with that audit is it had 13 state agencies, so there's a lot of players involved and a relatively short amount of time to review a broad scope of foundational controls that each agency needed to have in place. So we looked at security patching, which is critically important. There's been recent news about ransomware attacks. Those could have been prevented just by patching, applying Microsoft patches that had been released previously. We also looked at antivirus and malware protection, network monitoring and risk assessments, doing penetration tests to see where your vulnerabilities are, as well as security awareness training. And we developed findings in each of those areas across all 13 state agencies. So government in general is really struggling to get IT security done right. And it's just a broad and important topic right now.
Thank you, Mr. Green. That covered everything. Next, Commissioner Swanson will ask the third question.
Thank you. What do you do to ensure the highest level of cooperation between the auditor's office and the function being audited?
So one of the practices I do is really try to build relationships out there even before I go and audit. So right now I'm the president of the Institute of Internal Auditors in the Salem, Oregon chapter, which serves Salem all the way down to Ashland. And I network and build relationships with internal auditors, and I'm often engaging in audits of their agencies. So that helps smooth the process kind of in the get-go. I also engage in various professional organizations. I have some relationships with some economic professional organizations in Salem to really build those relationships with subject matter experts in the state. So then when I have questions, I can go to them. They're familiar with me. They feel comfortable responding to my requests. The other thing I like to do when I'm actually engaging in an audit is set really clear expectations with the auditee, so they understand what the process is, what sort of questions will be asked throughout the course of the audit. They understand their role in responding and providing evidence, and really just setting those clear communication with everybody so they know what to expect. They aren't blindsided. It's not a gotcha approach at the end. It's really a partnership that's there to add value to the organization, to help the organization meet its strategic mission and goals and priorities. An internal audit can help provide assurance that those are being well met, as well as bringing in best practices from around the state and around the country.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Williams will ask the fourth question. Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Based on your audit findings, tell us about the impact your recommendations have had on a specific program.
So I'll go back to the statewide IT security audit. We had a number of recommendations on various areas. So the first one was fix all the holes we found. There was some pretty gaping holes in terms of systems not being patched for a number of years. So we worked with each agency to patch those holes to protect their systems. We also made recommendations to the legislature to consider consolidating IT security at a statewide enterprise level, because currently it's operated in these silos across various state agencies. Some state agencies have no staffing or support for IT security because they're small, limited functions. But the problem is a hacker can come in through that system, gain access to the state network, and then jump to another more significant system in there. So you could come in through the Parks and Recreation Department, get into the state network, and then jump over to, say, Human Services or Revenue or really confidential information you want locked down. So the state's currently working on consolidating those services at an enterprise level. It's currently, I believe, on the House floor legislation to do that consolidation under the state CIO. Another recommendation we had was really do security awareness training. All state agencies really lacked security awareness training for their staff to understand. Don't email your passwords, don't give them out. Really basic stuff that's needed to protect information systems. So the state's currently rolling out various security awareness training to all state employees. And then they're also doing penetration tests and risk assessments of all state agencies, more than just the 13 we did under our audit. And recently they found that the Department of Environmental Quality had been hacked during that penetration test. Penetrators came in, got into a system, and then found evidence that somebody else had previously done that. So they were able to really assess broader risks across the state.
Thank you.
Commissioner Williams, does that satisfy your question? That's very good. Mr. Green, if we offer you the position, what do you expect to do in the first 90 days on the job?
So I think my first goal would be really building those relationships with department heads, the commissioners, and then the department staff as well, so that I understand the broad scope of operations in Lane County. And one of the things that I would like to do after kind of gaining that understanding, looking at what the risks are out there, is then start work on an audit or an IT risk assessment, depending on where I land there. And kind of start working on my strategic plan for the future and my audit plan going forward. I know Shanda Miller has put some considerable time and thought into that, and I would definitely consider those, but I'd also want to come in and make my own assessment. Government auditing standards also kind of require that if you use the work of other auditors, you make an assessment of the reliability of that work. So kind of getting my feet under me, understanding the operations here, building those relationships, and then start hitting the ground running with some audit work.
Right on. Good response. Then I'm going to ask you, do you have any questions from the Board of County Commissioners?
I do not.
You have no questions?
Yeah.
Do we have a follow-up?
Yeah, I wanted, going back to my first question as I was sitting here thinking about it a little bit, we didn't really get to the last part of the question was how you developed your work plan and your steps involved in approaching an audit when you were at the state. You talked about audits you had done, but you didn't really talk about
Sure.
who, was it your position to control which agency or audit you went on next, or was there somebody above you that was setting the audit work plan, and how much you were involved in actually planning out the audits, and also if I could get kind of an understanding of that.
Oh, certainly. So our office does an annual process of developing our audit topics for the following year. All staff contribute to that. They submit ideas throughout the year of risk areas they see while they're performing their audit work, or just as they're reading news or government reports that are out there. So that's kind of a cooperative process. The final decision is ultimately the agency director and the Secretary of State for what audits are performed. I've certainly contributed a number of ideas over the years that have led to audits that either I have performed or other people have performed. I started off as a staff auditor, so I was in the Department of Corrections audit that I mentioned. I was involved with the planning, but there is somebody above me that was ultimately responsible for developing the audit plan. I've been promoted twice within the office to a senior and then a principal auditor position. Within those positions, I was responsible for planning. So that would include the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families audit that won the national award, where I had key responsibilities for developing the audit plan and the field work steps, as well as the Fish and Wildlife audits. And the Medicaid audit I'm currently running right now. I've had 4 staff on that audit project. I've also worked a couple of other things I haven't mentioned of fraud investigations. I worked a fraud investigation at the University of Oregon on some payroll fraud a couple years ago, so I was involved in that, as well as an ongoing investigation of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is commonly known as food stamps. And our office has helped law enforcement convict 4 merchants that were defrauding the state to the tune of $20,000 to $30,000 a month. So I was deeply involved with that audit planning as well in developing the risk areas. As far as developing the specific steps, the first phase of the audit is really gaining an understanding of the program and the risk areas that are out there. So that's going to drive what field work you're going to do. You're going to come in, assess kind of the situation, assess any questions that are directed to me, and then develop steps, fieldwork steps that will test that. So is there a weakness here? Look at the process, see if there's any holes in the process, whether it's segregation of duties or maybe there's system issues. It really depends on what the audit objective is. And that audit objective and scope is going to drive the specific fieldwork steps you perform.
Okay. So thank you. So one last question. Harvard or Chicago school?
I think the new school in New York.
Okay. That may have
Good
gone
answer.
over something to say.
Yeah.
Depending on if you'd answered one of the 2, you may have made an enemy here. Excellent. Then with no further questions, Mr. Breen, thank you for being here today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
We'll go through a deliberation process, and we'll inform you what the next step is.
All right. Thank you.
Thank
Do you have an anticipated timeline for that?
We're scheduled for deliberation next Tuesday at our regular board meeting.
Sure.
That's on the schedule currently.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day. I do.
Okay. Then,
You have to read us into these.
Then, at the sound of the gavel, we will retire to executive session. And Ms. Mokrahysky, I believe we were scheduled to move to the BCC small. Is that still on tap, or since we're ahead of schedule? Other schedules. Excellent. Then the Board of Commissioners will meet in executive session in executive session to consider the employment of a public officer, employee, staff member, or individual agent. The executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.6602A, which allows the Board of Commissioners to meet in executive session for the purposes listed above. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decisions may be made in executive session. We reserve the right to come back out into public session should the need arise. At the sound, we will recess the regular board meeting and enter into executive session.